Hello and welcome to Stress-Free Longevity. This is episode 20 and today's guest is my first from South America. This is Dr. Euridice Martinez-Steele, a researcher in ultra-processed foods at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, who are leaders in this field. Lots to discuss. Let's jump right in. So, Dr. Euridice Martinez, welcome to Stress-Free Longevity. Usually how we begin, if you don't mind, is just with a little introduction. Do you mind just letting our listeners know where you are in the world and what your key interests are?
Yeah, so I've been based in Brazil for 15 years. And for about 12 years, I've been working in NUPENS in the University of Sao Paulo, pretty much focused on the topic of ultra-processed foods and how this affects dietary quality and health.
Fantastic. And any financial disclosures you want to make before we begin?
No, I have no conflict of interest and nothing to disclose.
Fantastic. Okay, look, we like to start with a little bit of science, if that's okay. So let's start with something quite basic. What exactly is food processing and what are the different levels of food processing?
Yeah, so food processing refers to the transformation of raw ingredients. This can be fruits, vegetables, grains, meat, or milk into food products that can be either consumed directly or can be used in cooking or can be preserved, for example, in salt, sugar, or in fact, this is something the industry does. They can be broken down and incorporated into food formulations. And this sort of processing can involve either physical, chemical, or biological methods. There's different classification systems, and I'm going to focus on the NOVA classification system, which is one of the most used and which is the one I've been working for the past 12 years. So this is a classification that was created by Professor Carlos Monteiro, based in Sao Paulo. And this classification categorizes foods according to the extent and purpose of industrial processing into 4 categories. The first one is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. The second is processed culinary ingredients. The third is processed foods. And the fourth is ultra-processed foods. I'll go through each of them briefly and we'll focus more on ultra-processed foods at the end. The first one is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Unprocessed foods are just edible parts of plants and animals right after their separation from nature, whereas minimally processed foods are foods that are subjected to some sort of industrial process, so very simple ones that pretty much doesn't change the nature of the food. This can be grinding, and importantly, without the addition of any substances such as salt, such as sugar, such as oil. And basically, this minimally process helps extend the life shelf of the product and also facilitates and diversifies food preparation. For example, we have frozen spinach. This really helps and facilitates its cooking in comparison to, for example, a raw spinach in which you would need to chop it and you would need a lot of it to be able to cook a meal. And examples of these minimally processed foods are fresh, dried, or frozen fruits or vegetables. It can be grains or flour and pasta, plain yogurt, fresh or frozen meat or fish. It's basically what people use to home cook. We have the second group, which are processed culinary ingredients, which are substances industrially extracted from processed or minimally processed foods or from nature. For example, is the case of salt. And the food industry produces these products, again, so people can home cook, right? So this would be oil, butter, salt, or sugar. And importantly, these foods are never consumed alone. So you don't need the sugar, you don't need olive oil or vegetable oil, you don't need butter alone, right? You usually add it to fresh foods to cook. Then we have the third group, which is processed foods that are, again, very simple foods that are produced by the food industry just by adding sugar or salt or oil to minimally processed foods. And the purpose of processing this sort of processing is just to preserve or enhance the sensory properties of minimally processed foods. For example, this can be artisanal bread or artisanal cheese or canned fruit, right, with added sugar. And then we have the fourth group, which is going to be basically what we're going to talk about, which are defined as industrial formulations of food-derived substances such as oils, fats, sugars, like starch, that contain little or no whole food and often include additives that have a cosmetic function, which can be flavorings, colorings, emulsifiers. This is very important because that means it's not a real food. It's basically a combination of molecules that often are not found in natural foods, and you find them in these formulations in different proportions from those that you use and you find in nature, right? So they're often, for example, high in fat or sugar or salt, and these sort of ingredients are not found in the same food in nature. And they also have synthetic molecules. And all this formulation, we're not necessarily adapted to. Our bodies do not necessarily know how to handle these and metabolize this formulation of ingredients. Something that characterizes ultra-processed foods is their convenience because they're imperishable or ready to consume. They're hyperpalatable, and because of their aggressive marketing, it gives them a very enormous market advantage. And what sort of examples we have? We have carbonated soft drinks, we have sweeter, savory packaged snacks, instant soups, among others. And if you go to the supermarket, a way to identify these ultra processed foods is that they often have a very large list of ingredients, which can be protein isolates or gluten or casein or whey protein that you don't find in natural foods. And they also have, as I mentioned before, cosmetic additives, which are flavors or flavor enhancers or colors that are totally synthetic. And again, our bodies may not be able to handle them.
In some of my other interviews, some of the nutrition experts I've interviewed have been less fond of the classification, primarily because I think they feel it's a little too broad, particularly the category 4, the ultra-processed food, because it categorizes things together that may be some less unhealthy things like fish fingers alongside or within the same grouping as what you would traditionally think of as more unhealthy, like cookies and crisps and things. Do you think this matters?
Yeah, so even though, as you said, Nova categorizes different types of foods as ultra processed, right? We have yogurts, we have breads, we have soft drinks. This does not necessarily equate them, right, in terms of health impacts or diet quality. Sodas for sure are less healthy than yogurts. But they do have a common characteristic, which can be a driver of disease, and there's a growing evidence of this. On the other hand, what we can say also is that, for example, an ultra-processed version of a food, when you compare it to a non-ultra-processed version, for sure is less healthy. For example, if we compare an ultra-processed version of a yogurt, for example, flavored yogurt, it's likely to be less healthy than an unprocessed yogurt. The first one has additives, which we don't know really the effects on the body, whereas the other one doesn't. So again, ultra-processed version of a food is less healthy. On the other hand, even though it's a broad category, grouping them together has a reason. And this is because the NOVA classification was devised in 2009 to test a hypothesis, which is whether an increased consumption of ultra-processed foods could be a driver of disease and could explain the increasing prevalence of obesity and other chronic diseases over time in the past decades. And again, the idea is that for epidemiologists to be able to measure the degree of exposure to ultra-processed foods. Because, as for example, eating more ultra-processed foods means that you're more exposed to cosmetic additives, to combinations of foods, And this is what we wanted to test, or we want to test, whether this drives disease. It's a bit like the Mediterranean dietary pattern. Many countries recommend adhering to this dietary pattern, but this does not presume that all its underlying components are equally healthy. For example, vegetables are probably more healthy than olive oil. For example, an excess consumption of vegetables is healthier than consuming an excess amount of olive oil.
So we've probably been researching ultra-processed foods now for something like 15 years or 20 years, something like that. How would you summarize all of the evidence that we have so far, particularly focusing on the best evidence? How would you summarize that? Are ultra-processed foods negatively affecting human health?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's already cumulative evidence from the past 50 years. Many studies have been carried out across the whole world. And there's one study that was published in 2024 that gathered all this evidence. In this study, they evaluated the evidence of association between ultra-processed food consumption and risk of different health conditions. And yeah, they evaluated almost 10 million participants. And what they showed is that there was evidence that increased ultra-processed food consumption was associated with different health outcomes such as mortality, obesity, high blood pressure, worse blood fat profile, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer, especially those related to obesity, such as colorectal cancer or breast cancer. Also, there was evidence of association with gastrointestinal disease, frailty, dementia, and depression. Probably these are more mental diseases linked to the imbalance of the gut microbiota. And this is evidence from epidemiological studies, basically observational studies, which do have their potential biases. But in addition to this, there are two randomized control trials which allow you to infer causality, which showed that participants with a higher ultra-processed food consumption ended up gaining more weight over a 2-week period and also having an increased energy intake, which probably led to that increased weight gain. Even though the evidence is growing, we already have quite solid evidence that increased ultra-processed food consumption is a driver of up to 32 health outcomes, including quite prevalent diseases such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity.
We will come to some of the potential reasons for that shortly, but there is so much conflicting science and opinion which muddies the water, and probably more so in nutrition than nearly any other topic. And there will likely be people who question any concerns about ultra-processed foods. Why do you think this is, and what would you say to those people?
I would start by saying that the best quality evidence is from studies with no conflict of interest. And what does this mean? Studies that are not funded from the food industry. Why? Because the food industry has a different objective, which is to make money. The food industry has its role, it's important, but they shouldn't be funding this sort of evidence, this sort of studies. And people who have questioned NOVA are basically, most of them, let's say 95%, come from big corporations who have a lot to lose if UPFs are regulated. They're interested in creating confusion to delay regulation. And what sort of arguments do they use? First of all, that it's difficult to untangle what of this association is due to diet and what is due to lifestyle. This is because both tend to be correlated, right? So people with unhealthier diet that consume ultra processed foods maybe tend to smoke more, to do less physical activity. So it's not always easy to understand what's driving disease. But there is epidemiology ways to work around this, which is basically adjusting for these variables. But there's always risk of having residual confound. So this is one of the arguments that is used. The other one is that association is not causation, even though we have a couple randomized controlled trials which give us a hint that these sort of associations, for example, with weight gain, may reflect causation. On the other hand, doing randomized controlled trials, which would be the ideal, is expensive, maybe unethical because you cannot follow up people consuming a large amount of ultra processed foods during a long period of time to see whether the risk of developing, let's say, cancer is higher than in people that consume less ultra processed foods. And I have to say that many of the arguments that they use were the same ones that were used by the industry of tobacco. For example, they used as an argument that other lifestyle variables correlated with smoking could explain the association between smoking and increased risk of lung cancer. Another argument they used, the tobacco industry, was that there's no proof that cigarette causes cancer. A third argument that they've used is that there are other causes of lung cancer, which, on the other hand, does not dismiss the fact that smoking can be an additional driver of lung cancer. And another argument they use is that there's no agreement among authorities regarding the cause of lung cancer. And there's even researchers today that do not agree that tobacco increases the risk of lung cancer. So even though, of course, the industry of tobacco is different than the industry of food, you can see that the sort of arguments are quite equivalent.
Let's talk about some of the potential dangers, if that's okay. Why might ultra processed food not be good for our health? What for you is the greatest issue?
There are different characteristics in ultra processed foods that may be driving this increased risk of conditions, of diseases. For example, we have the high calorie density. This is because ultra processed foods tend to be high in fat and sugar and low in fiber and water, which in the end leads to more calories per mouthful. So if you compare, for example, the calories you consume eating one serving of apple with the calories consumed with one serving of soda, that one serving of soda provides much more calories. This, in the end, increases the eating rate. This is the calories per minute, which ends up driving overconsumption. This is interesting because the only two randomized control trials that researchers have carried out did show that people during the ultra processed diet consume many more calories per minute. So this is something that's actually been proved by the gold standard epidemiological study. Another characteristic is their deconstructed food matrix. As I said before, ultra-processed foods is not really a food, it's a food formulation. And this deconstructed food matrix makes them soft. And of course, foods that are soft are eaten faster. Again, this takes you to eating far more calories per minute. And it also drives not feeling full until long after you have finished. And again, this drives overconsumption. Also, the fact that they're soft means that they don't need to be as chewed as, for example, foods that have more fiber. And this can potentially lead to dental problems, in addition to reduced fascial bone size and density. Another issue is their hyperpalatability, which is driven basically by their high fat content, high fat sugar and salt content, plus additives. All this can create addiction and affects the reward system in society and can also affect the endocrine system. This induces binge eating and more snacking, and again leads to overconsumption. Something else that's not really a property of the foods themselves, but is more about the context, is the fact that they're convenient, they have a lower price, and they're highly marketed. This makes them highly available and again drives constant and thoughtless eating. So it's different if you have a ready to eat cake than if you have to cook it yourself. It's there, it's available. You feel like having cake, so you go and you eat it.
As well as increasing calorie content, and obviously for the reasons that you've described, what other impacts may increased salt, fat, and sugar content have on human health?
Yeah, as you mentioned, in addition to the drive over consumption, the fact that they are high in added sugars maybe or there's evidence that increases the risk of obesity and body fat, as well as type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This added sugar can also increase the risk of chronic inflammation and also dental problems. There's also evidence that increased consumption of ultra processed foods leads to increased consumption of saturated fat. And there's evidence that saturated fat increases the risk of elevated LDL cholesterol as well as total cholesterol, increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, also the risk of type 2 diabetes, and fat deposition in the liver. Trans fats also increase when you eat a lot of ultra processed foods. And the risk of these trans fats is increasing the LDL cholesterol and decreasing HDL cholesterol, as well as increased risk of coronary heart disease, systemic inflammation, and oxidative stress, as well as endothelial dysfunction, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. The fact that they are high in salt increases the risk of elevated blood pressure and hypertension, cardiovascular disease, as well as kidney disease, and other conditions such as osteoporosis and stomach cancer. And lastly, I would say that the decreased fiber consumption, or because of the lower content of fiber in ultra-processed foods, may lead to digestive disorders, increased risk of heart disease, again, higher risk of type 2 diabetes, can lead to weight management issues, as well as very important and altered gut microbiota.
So, in nutrition interviews that I've done, we tend to talk a lot about macronutrients. But I'd like to ask you about micronutrients. What can you say about the content of micronutrients within ultra processed foods?
Yeah, I'll start by saying that human studies have shown that increased ultra-processed food consumption is associated with lower intake of micronutrients such as niacin, folate, vitamins B12 and C, as well as minerals like calcium and magnesium. This is because ultra-processed foods tend to be poor in these nutrients, and also because, as I mentioned earlier, the more ultra-processed foods that you consume, the less whole foods rich in these nutrients you end up consuming. And why is it that ultra-processed foods have less micronutrients? Part of it has to do with the extensive processing, like techniques such as refining, extrusion, and high temperature cooking can degrade or remove these nutrients from ultra-processed foods. And even though some of these ultra-processed foods are fortified afterwards, this does not mean that these vitamins are always as bioavailable as the ones occurring in natural foods. And then I'll also like to mention we have to be wary that many times the food industry uses this fortification as a health claim to market unhealthy foods and attract consumers.
So, you mentioned earlier that one way to identify ultra processed foods is to see lots and lots of ingredients. And of course, there'll be so many now that we don't recognize, and many are clearly unnatural, I guess. Now, our presumption, I guess it was my presumption and perhaps others, that all of these ingredients must be okay. Surely no one would put untested, potentially dangerous compounds in food. But is that the case? Should we be more wary? And what are some examples of potentially harmful ingredients within food that we should know about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, theoretically, no one would put untested, potentially dangerous compounds in foods. Now, something to take into account, for example, is that in Europe, there are over 2,000 approved additives whereas in the US, it's estimated that there's over 10,000 additives that are approved. However, I have to say that some additives are generally recognized as safe, even though the following is unknown, right? First of all, the long-term effects of these compounds are unknown. This is because many times the safety is tested in rats and mice over a short period of time. So again, what are the long-term effects? This is pretty much unknown. Also, what the cumulative effects across multiple foods, or in other words, the effects of overall daily intakes are also unknown. And the effects of the interaction between these additives are also pretty much unknown. And as I mentioned before, that many of these tests are carried out in mice, but what are the effects in humans are pretty much unknown as well. I think that in this sense, a precautionary approach should be adopted by the authorities. First of all, revising the effects of all these additives that are already in the market, and also requesting more rigorous testing of these additives before they're approved. So, in regards to the effects of the specific additives, for example, there is evidence that emulsifiers impact the gut microbiome, affect the gut barrier function, and cause inflammation. And there's already some studies in humans that have shown that increased consumption of emulsifiers increases the risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. There's also evidence that increased consumption of artificial sweeteners increases the long-term effects of metabolic health and cardiovascular risk, as well as affecting the gut microbiome. And in fact, in humans, again, there's already some studies that have observed that increased consumption of artificial sweeteners increases the risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. There's also evidence that colors may promote gut barrier disruption, inflammation, and risk for colitis, and also that they may have immune effects causing allergies and hypersensitivity. In regards to flavors, there's some evidence that they may promote overeating, allergic reactions, and also respiratory problems. And in regards to nitrates and nitrates, they're suspected to be carcinogens and may have potential thyroid effects. In humans, there's already some evidence of the association between increased nitrates and nitrates as consumption and type 2 diabetes. In regards to the molecules in packaging, ultra-processed foods tend to be packaged foods, and the fact that they have a long shelf life increases the risk of this contamination by molecules in packaging, increases the risk of exposure to endocrine disruptive chemicals, which may have also a metabolic and cardiovascular effects. And also the processing they're subjected to, the ultra-processed foods, may generate molecules such as acrylamides, which are potentially carcinogenic and neurotoxic.
So you've touched on it, I think, in a couple of questions there, but I was just wanted to ask you specifically about the microbiome because it's a very popular topic now. How does ultra-processed food impact our microbiomes?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, as you said, it's a very popular topic. And even though we know little, there's increasing evidence of its importance. So I'd start by saying that for every one cell of our body, there are around 100 other organisms, which include viruses, bacteria, protozoans, archaea, fungi, worms, and mites. And the highest concentrations of these organisms in our body are found in the gut, and particularly at the end of the small intestine. And it's not only important, the numbers, but also the diversity. So there are about between 500 and 1,000 bacterial species that live within us. And there's growing evidence that the microbiome has profound effects on our physiology and behavior, including mental health. And as I said, it is only recently that we have begun to better understand its complexity and importance. So the gut barrier is composed of a mucus layer, immune cells, and gut epithelium that are joined by very tight junctions. And this gut barrier acts as a shield, separating gut organisms from the bloodstream. And the integrity of this barrier is essential for the proper functioning of the body. That relies on the diversity and balance of microbial populations in each part of the gut. And now, disruption of this balance, which is known as dysbiosis, has been linked to inflammatory bowel disease, severe inflammation conditions, autoimmune diseases, allergic disorders, and metabolic diseases. Now, going back to ultra-processed foods, as we mentioned before, these tend to be lack in fiber. And it's important because this dietary fiber is fermented by gut bacteria into short chain fatty acids, which are a source of energy for certain bacteria. And the lack of this fiber, and thus of these short chain fatty acids, forces gut bacteria to use alternative energy sources, for example, mucus in the gut lining. And this foraging of host mucus can erode the mucus barrier, bringing bacteria into closer contact with the epithelium and potentially increasing the risk of certain bacteria that promote inflammation and metabolic disturbances to leak into the bloodstream. In addition to the lack of fiber in ultra-processed foods, these also tend to contain emulsifiers, thickeners, and artificial sweeteners. And there's also evidence that these additives disrupt the gut microbiome and reduce the specific gut bacteria that produce the short chain fatty acids. And again, this lower production of short chain fatty acids can erode the mucus barrier and contributing to inflammation and metabolic disturbances, increasing the risk, for example, of type 2 diabetes.
That is fascinating. How would you kind of put all that together now? Just if you were to summarize that in a little brief outline of how ultra-processed foods impact health.
Yeah, so there are several characteristics of ultra-processed foods that might drive disease. This would be their high palatability, high energy density, and soft texture, and also their high content in added sugar, fat, and salt, which drives overconsumption by increasing the eating rate. Another characteristic of ultra-processed foods that may be driving disease is the low micronutrient content, as well as the fact that they end up displacing the consumption of foods that are rich in these micronutrients. Another issue, a characteristic of ultra-processed foods that may lead to disease is the higher risk of contamination by food packaging molecules. This is, for example, phthalates and bisphenol, and also their higher content of molecules that are created during the processing of these foods, such as acrylamides.
Are there any particular populations that should be especially concerned about ultra-processed food, such as children, elderly, people with comorbid conditions, or is it simply a risk for everyone fairly equally?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much a risk for all subpopulations, but I think it's worth, for example, mentioning a couple vulnerable subpopulations, which would be children and also pregnant women. This is because children, for example, are still developing. All these characteristics of ultra processed foods, the synthetic additives, may affect their development. This is because also children end up consuming more of these toxic compounds or synthetic additives in proportion to their size. And also, for example, children, if they start consuming these ultra processed foods rich in these sort of molecules, they end up being exposed at an early age and they'll end up having a prolonged exposure, which will increase the risk of long term health effects. In regards to pregnant women, their exposure to ultra processed foods may affect the development of the fetus and further extend the exposure to these effects of ultra-processed foods of the future child.
I think I've been convinced that ultra-processed foods are harmful. It would seem the evidence is supporting that. So what do we do about it? If someone's listening, what is needed to combat this issue?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's very important is for regulation. And so public policies, right? For populations to reduce their ultra-processed food consumption, we can work on several frontiers, right? One strategy is to develop dietary guidelines to recommend avoiding or reducing the consumption of ultra-processed foods. There are more than 11 countries, including Brazil, that now recommend in their dietary guidelines to avoid ultra-processed foods. Another way to decrease this exposure or the consumption of ultra-processed foods is through front of package warning labels, which, for example, distinguishes packaged foods with excessive levels of energy, sugar, salt, and fat. Many or several countries in Latin America have already implemented front of package warning labels, and other countries have adopted but not yet implemented this legislation. In regards to fiscal policies, most of them have focused on sugar sweetened beverages, and these have been taxed in over 45 countries already. In 2023, on the other hand, for example, Colombia introduced the first law in Latin America and I think in the world taxing ultra-processed foods that have these front of package warning labels. And other countries such as Mexico and Hungary have implemented taxes on selected ultra-processed foods. Another way to reduce ultra-processed food consumption is through marketing regulations. Chile, which is one of the countries with a higher prevalence of obesity, including in children, have implemented the most comprehensive food marketing policies. And there they banned all marketing of foods with nutrient warning labels. So this is the foods that are high in added sugar, fat, saturated fat, and total energy. And they've specifically banned marketing of foods towards children that are younger than 14 years of age. For example, they've banned advertising that appeal to children, such as cartoons. Other countries, such as Brazil, for example, have banned ultra-processed food marketing in schools. Other ways to decrease the ultra-processed food consumption is through public procurement policies. In Brazil, for example, at least 75% of school lunch funds must be spent on unprocessed foods, and acquisition of several ultra-processed foods is prohibited. And other countries have implemented similar regulations. Another way to favor reduced consumption of ultra-processed foods is through subsidies of whole foods. Something else that needs to be done is the reevaluation of the safety and health effects of common food additives. As I mentioned before, this reevaluation would be needed, taking into account overall levels of doses consumed by the population. And it would be important to evaluate the long-term effects and cocktail effects of these combinations of additives. Again, in line with what I just mentioned, it would be important to ban additives that are not proven to be safe, following the precautionary principle. It's very important to educate at school and at home, emphasizing the importance of eating fruit and vegetables, something in line with what is done in Japan. It's very important also to incentive people to cook, right? So maybe implement programs to teach cooking skills at school and at home. I know it's difficult to cook. Many of us have lost the skills, but I think it's very important to do so and to involve all members of the family. It can be something fun. I just think it's important for us to regain those skills.
So it's very interesting that a lot of this is happening around the world, but it's naturally going to take a long time, isn't it? So until all of this happens, if it happens, how does the average person navigate this landscape? If you are convinced that it's maybe something we need to reduce, what would be your kind of main tips for healthily eating in the current environment?
Yeah, so I think one key step would be to avoid buying ultra processed foods, right? These are readily available in many environments. So, at an individual level, if we can avoid buying them, that would be a good step forward. To do this, it is often difficult to avoid these sort of foods in the supermarket. So I think it's maybe important to avoid these sort of food aisles where you find these sort of foods. I think something that can help in this way is shopping at local markets where there's more fruits and vegetables available. I think it's very important to read the list of ingredients and food labels. Reading through these ingredients, it will help you identify what are ultra processed foods to avoid them, and will also give you a sense of the sort of additives you're exposed to. One tip would be to avoid, in line with what I said before, would be to avoid foods that have a long list of ingredients, and the less additives, the better. Also, avoid foods that are high in saturated fats, sugar, and salt. And by doing so, you will probably end up reducing the consumption of ultra processed foods. When you're eating, I think a key point is to fill your plate with whole foods. These are satiating, and you probably drop down the consumption of ultra processed foods. And even though, as we mentioned at the start, even though not all ultra processed foods are equally unhealthy, again, the less ultra processed foods you consume overall, the better. This will decrease your overall exposure to all these additives, which may be healthy, but maybe not. We still don't know. Something important as well, I think, is not to eat alone, because when we eat alone, we tend to eat these sort of ultra processed, ready to eat foods. I also think it's important to eat slowly because it's a way to give the chance to your body to send a message that you're satiated. And again, as I mentioned in my previous point, is to learn to cook and involve the whole family.
And then the challenges for parents. Have you any tips on how parents can navigate this landscape for their children?
Yeah, so I think it would be important to make more available at home fruits and vegetables, and having less ultra processed foods again at home, setting a good example by cooking. This would be a way to pass on the right message and being consistent. I think it would be important to involve the kids in the cooking and teach them to cook. I also think it's important to eat together, do a conscious eating. It's not just like taking your food and eating it in front of TV. Do something as I mentioned, something together. And I think it's nice also to incentive children to read the list of ingredients. I ask my children to do this without overemphasizing it, but I think it's a way of educating kids as well to navigate in this world full of ultra processed foods.
Dr. Euridice Martinez, thank you so much for joining me today. That has been extremely enlightening. We usually leave our speaker one last chance just to leave the listener with one final take home message. What would you like to leave them with today?
Talking about ultra processed foods and why they're potentially harmful, I would say that they have a high energy density, they are hyperpalatable, they increase the eating rate, they induce binge eating, they drive overconsumption, they have additives with unknown effects, especially long term, and the interactions between these different sort of additives. And this all may affect the gut microbiome and lead to metabolic disorders. There's increasing evidence that in humans, overall ultra processed food consumption leads to excessive energy intake, gut barrier disruption, metabolic disruption, and be a driver of other health conditions, such as, for example, depression or anxiety. When you purchase foods at the supermarket, it would be to avoid buying and consuming also ultra-processed foods. The less ultra-processed food you consume, the better. I think it's important to read the list of ingredients so you gain consciousness about what you're eating. I would say to avoid foods with long list of ingredients and prioritize consuming whole foods, especially fruit, vegetables, and legumes. I think it's also important to cook and involve the family in cooking and eating together.
Dr. Euridice Martinez, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. My pleasure.
Huge thanks again to Dr. Euridice Martinez-Steele for the interview. My key take-home messages are: number one, ultra-processed foods aren't really food. They are a formulation of molecules our bodies didn't evolve to handle. Long ingredient lists with things you don't recognise, that's the giveaway. Number two, the evidence is substantial. A 2024 study of nearly 10 million people linked UPF consumption to 32 health outcomes, including increased heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and depression. Number three, these foods are engineered to make you overeat. Soft texture, hyperpalatability, more calories per minute. You don't feel full until long after you've finished. It's not willpower, it's design. Number four, your gut bacteria suffer. Without fibre, they start eating the mucus lining of your gut, and combined with the additives in ultra-processed foods, this can lead to inflammation and metabolic disease. And finally, number five, the practical advice is simple: cook more, eat with others, read labels, and fill your plate with whole foods. The less ultra-processed foods overall, the better. You can watch this and all the interviews on my YouTube channel, Stress Free Longevity. All the details are on the website stressfreelongevity.com. Until next time, take care.